So this talk probably makes more sense if you've looked at the code labs, ran through the repro instructions, or whatnot, and actually experienced a lot of these pain points that I'm going to talk about. But here's a preview. It's a follow-up to Aaron's end-to-end contribution talk, so just to cover some of the issues that you may or may not run into. Cool. So I'm Cathy. This is me on GitHub. I'm not on Twitter. Was that a joke? Sorry. Yeah, so let's start with building. Aaron introduced us to the gulp command. Yeah, but it actually takes 4 minutes, which is really slow. If it runs build first before watch and serve. So even though after 4 minutes, it's like pretty fast, you still have to wait 4 minutes. No, you don't actually have to. So most of the time, you are trying to build some specific example file, right, like an AMP HTML file. You can actually just build the extensions that you need instead of the 117 extensions that you don't need. So this parameter will actually let you just build the extensions that you need for the whichever example or manual test file that you are working with. And then we also have the 4-minute gulp build for development and debugging. It builds unminified files. And also, all of our build process, it basically just generates files in the dist folder of our repo. And so you'll see files .max and then the source map for gulp build. If you want something closer to our production binaries, which are minified by the Clojure compiler, just go ahead and run gulp dist. It's a lot slower, 13 minutes roughly on my computer. We use it for regression testing mostly. So after you've basically looked, you've built your component or you've made your change, and I just want to verify that it doesn't break on a closer to production environment. And then we also have 3 different serving modes. So default, if you just run gulp, right, gulp build, gulp dist, it always serves unminified AMP. And then you can also pass -- compiled, which will serve minified AMP, goes through the Clojure compiler. More details on this will be in Ragu's talk tomorrow. And there's also -- CDN, which literally just serves production binaries from the CDN. This is more useful later when I go in to talk about regression testing. But if you want to just change them without rerunning gulp, you can just hit this URL with curl, a GET request, or just navigate to it in your browser. So on to testing. Usually we have 2 places for manual testing. One is actually test/manual and name of your component .amp.html. Usually that's the file where we will place a lot of manual tests. So for any component that you develop, if you add a new feature, just add a test case there with the attribute that you added or with whatever, just set that up in this file. So usually you just make a new one if you have a new component or add to an existing one. So after a component has been finished, and usually we add a example file. This is not really like edge case testing, but it's more like, hey, this is how we use this component. So this file, again, ampfoo is your component name. Usually, so after you make a change, you want to go here and verify that this example still works very well. And if you're adding anything new, just make sure to update this example file to showcase your new feature. So sometimes people here work with progressive web apps and Shadow DOM. We actually have a PWA inside the repo for testing that looks a little bit like this. So to actually use it or test with it, you want to run gulp with Shadow. This will build the amp-shadow file. And next, basically, where is our PWA located? It's located at localhost 0.8000/PWA. And I previously mentioned an examples directory or a test/manual directory, but you can basically append the path of any file that you want to test after the PWA. So you can replace that with any other file in examples, actually, or test/manual. Cool. So more on this at in the contributing folder under testing.md. But I need to test on phones too, right? Fine. That was my attempt at a joke. Anyway, so Android debugging, yay! I guess first thing here is you have to enable remote debugging on your phone. There are some pretty good instructions on Google about this, but TLDR is you have to tap a build number 7 times, and then developer options show up, and then you basically turn developer debugging on and USB debugging on. And now you connect that to your computer with a USB, and then you have this in Chrome Developer Tools. So this 3-dot button, more tools, remote devices, yay, and then you select discover the USB device after your Android phone is connected with a USB, and then make sure to forward port 8000, because that's where basically our local development happens. You can also do this with iOS. Well, actually for iOS, Xcode has an iOS simulator. It is very well hidden inside Xcode. You have to click on Show Package Contents, and under Contents/Developer/Applications, there's a simulator app. It's actually really, really cool. Looks like this. You open this, and it can actually also access your local host 8000 port. Cool. All right. But sometimes we need to send it off to a QA team, right, to do cross-browser QA, or I really need to show this to the designer working on my team, or just for whatever reason, I really, really, really need to deploy it somewhere. Fine. This dog is, oh, OK, cool. The dog wanted to stay. So we can deploy demo. Yay. So this is one of multiple ways to deploy the AMP repo, but Firebase is one of the free things you can use. So in Firebase, basically create an account and add a new project, call it AMP demo or whatever you like. And then here, come back to the AMP HTML repository folder, wherever you've cloned that to, and run Firebase login. You'll need to actually install npm install Firebase tools. But basically, run Firebase login. It'll open a browser window and tell you to log in. And then you run Firebase init. And then basically, it'll say, and then you want to select hosting. I only actually need hosting. I don't actually need a database for this or anything. And then you select the project you created, which I created AMP demo project here. And then the one thing here is, so you want to select your Firebase folder, the local Firebase folder as your public directory. So yeah, we wrote a a gulp task to basically generate everything you need to deploy to Firebase. So just run that with gulp Firebase, and it'll actually create the Firebase folder, and it will copy all the dist files over to dist.3p files over to dist.3p, and your example files and manual files. So basically, examples and manual test files were the files that we were testing on, right? So exactly the files we want to deploy, and so yeah, and then the last step there is just to run Firebase deploy. It'll basically SCP, copy and upload all of the files in your Firebase folder, and then to Firebase. And then, yay, now I have my demo app deployed. Cool. So again, part of what I'm trying to do here is save everyone time. So usually, you've been developing, and you run gulp build. You were testing already, so sometimes you don't need to run build again. Saves for 4 minutes. Sometimes you want to deploy a minified version of all of your files instead of the unminified version. So use --min for that. And sometimes I actually only care about one AMP HTML file, right? I don't want to actually copy all of manual or all of examples. Just pass it a file. All right, more is in our documentation here under the contributing folder, testing with Firebase. Right, but so at this point, I'm done developing. I'm done with basic debugging, but I'm still not super comfortable. Like maybe my change touches a lot of things, and I just really, really want to make sure that I didn't want to that I did not break all images on AMP. Cool. Oh, dog wants to stay. Wants me to press the button twice. So guess what we can do here? We can test production pages with local changes. Yay. Sorry, I tried to make that rhyme. So here's an easy way to do it, right? We have localhost 8000, which is where we're running AMP HTML, the repository. And we actually have a /proxy. So here we can actually just use any public URL that has a AMP doc, and we just append it to localhost 8000 /proxy/. Yeah, so what this will actually do, so this is, of course, assuming that you are running AMP, that you're running gulp, right? And that your local files are actually being served. But basically what this will do is proxy all of the CDN files on this particular website with your local files. And then to make this even simpler, we have a Chrome extension that does this for you. So instead of running everything through localhost 8000, you can also just click install this extension and then check between online CDN and local AMP. So if you check local AMP, what it'll do is run all of the files referenced by whatever web page that you're browsing. Use the local version of AMP files instead of the online version of AMP files. And it lives in so this is the AMP HTML repository. It lives in testing /local AMP Chrome extension. Yeah. There are some pretty cool things you can do with this Chrome extension, actually. You can modify it. So you can modify it to actually change production pages. So one thing that I did, like once upon a time, I was working on AMP Lightbox Gallery, which is like an upgraded alternative to the common pattern of shoving a carousel inside a lightbox, right? So basically, I could tweak this extension to actually rewrite production pages to take out all references to carousel plus lightbox, and then just reference AMP Lightbox Gallery instead. So I actually went and on whatever web pages, some publisher web pages and some e-commerce pages that use this pattern, I actually went and pre-tested my component before I actually launched it. So the Chrome extension is good if you want to do something more complicated than just proxying your AMP pages, like actually rewriting the page itself. And instructions on doing that specifically can actually be found in this README here. Next on to automated testing. So yes, I've manually verified and that my stuff works and doesn't break anything. So I want to keep it that way. Great, automating testing. So well, OK. So more common example is I made a change, a contribution, and it fails tests. Now what? Sad cat. So yay, we can debug those tests, of course. So yeah. Gulp test -- local changes. So again, Aaron previously went over the basics of testing, and Ed's talk with time ago, we also went through some basic testing. But here's -- local changes. So let's just say I'm not creating a new component. I'm just making a change, and it's failing tests. So this will run all tests related to the change that I made, so I can see which ones that failed, right? And then I can pass it -- files. So again, I'm debugging this one particular test suite, right? Just pass that in. And then I use -- watch to say, oh, I'm going to run this. It's going to keep running. I'll make a test and then rerun it automatically to see what happens. And then, of course, I can test in whatever browser I like. So I can pass in Safari, -- Firefox, and it'll, instead of Chrome, which is the default, run in Safari or Firefox. And if I run gulp test -- watch with some breakpoints, basically the test will look like this. So I just added a breakpoint here, and it'll actually allow me to step through the test. You can add the breakpoint in the test or in the component itself, and you can debug your test this way. But hey, that file has like 50 tests, and I only want to run one of them, right? So there's a trick for that. Use it.only. So instead of running like the 120 tests in this particular file, I will only run the one that is breaking. That will make my life a lot easier. And finally, we have two types of tests currently in the AMP HTML repository, we have unit tests and integration tests. So generally, unit tests will look something like this. It will usually include like a function that sets up the component and appends it to like the AMP doc that we're testing with. And it'll mock a lot of things like runtime functions, mutate element, and you'll also be calling like resource cycle callbacks manually. Basically, these are useful for verifying the logic that's particular to your component. Like, oh, I fetch a URL from somewhere, or like I do some calculations somewhere. I want to verify that this logic is correct. So that's unit tests. And then we have integration tests. They look something like this. So in particular, you'll notice that there's like actual like AMP HTML here that you will write. And it's like a black box test of a component inside an AMP doc. And so there's no mocking here. And usually what we'll do with these tests is we'll trigger some kind of event, usually a click event. And then we'll verify that, hey, these pieces of CSS show up. Or after this animation, this thing shows up, and this other piece of UI shows up inside the DOM. Usually we'll use something like setTimeout or a mutation observer, basically to observe expected changes in the DOM. And so a lot of our tests are asynchronous. You deal with that by either returning a promise or handling it using a generator. And I think some tests also use async await as well. But yeah. OK, so validation. I just added a new attribute to a component, but it doesn't validate. Now what? What you need to do is add your attribute to the validator spec. So this is a really simple example where I added the animate attribute to AMP accordion to allow people to animate like the expansion and collapse of AMP accordion. But basically, the validation file lives here. So in your extension /component name /validator -component name.proto-ASCII, and then add it in alphabetical order, or else Greg will come and yell at you. And the one caveat here is in order to run the validator, you want to use gulp validate, or there's a validator folder in the AMP HTML repository, and you want to run python validator /build-up-high. But in order to run it, you have to install a few things, namely protobuf and Google. The instructions for this are in the README file for the validator folder. But just remember, when it breaks, it's because you kind of have to install a few things. So there's a magic --update test parameter that allows you to basically just update the tests instead of having to rewrite the verification file for the test. But right. OK, cool. So we're done with manual testing. We're done with regression testing, automation testing, and we fixed our validation. What's next? Submitting a PR. What can go wrong with it? Well, we'll ask you to sign a CLA, but like, I signed it already, and it still tells me I didn't sign it. Why? So the most common reason that that doesn't validate is because the author's email address in GitHub is sometimes wrong. So for example, I signed the CLA with this, but sometimes my personal email shows up because on my personal laptop, I've configured it to use my personal email. Well, you can verify that by just using git log and just checking the author to see if that's the same email that you signed your CLA with. Yeah, and then you can fix that by using git commit --amend. And then you can pass in the author name. And then, voila, yay, I just changed my email here. Cool. Oh, git things. So a really common problem is, well, a lot of you probably are not working on AMP full time. So sometimes you open a PR, and the next time you look at it, 2 weeks has passed, 3 weeks has passed, but merge conflicts have appeared. Now what? So, well, merge or rebase. So you can git fetch upstream master and git merge upstream master, or use git rebase depending on whether or not you want to rewrite history. And then, yeah, if it goes wrong, abort it. if everything looks good, continue. And in the middle of that, resolve merge conflicts. If you've rebased or amended anything, you will have to force push, sadly, rewrite Git history. But the note is try not to use -- force. Try to use force with lease instead, because well, you might have other people working with you on that PR, so force with lease is a safer version of git push force that will only let you force push if no one else's push changes. So you won't accidentally overwrite anyone else's changes, which sometimes happens. Yeah, so this is kind of useful when you break down your PR into multiple different PRs for review, right? I do this a lot where I put out one small-ish PR, but it's under review. I don't want to be blocked by that, so I will try to develop on top of my PR that is currently in review. It's a pretty common workflow. Yeah, stacked PRs. So, but then it later becomes a pain, right? But this is how to not make it a pain. So basically, you can check out branch 2 that is dependent on branch 1. And then maybe I'll update branch 1, right? So I'll add some commits and fix up my review. And then what I'll do is I'll git rebase. So on branch 2, I will rebase off of branch 1 to basically take all those changes that I've added. And then, so if you update branch 1 again, you rinse and repeat. And then at some point, my PR1 for branch 1 gets merged to master. Yay! Right? So then what I'll do there, after I've rebased, right? Then I'll git fetch upstream master. And then I'll git rebase -i for an interactive rebase. And then I'll drop all the commits from branch 1. So basically, I won't redo the commits from branch 1 again. And it'll look something like this. Basically, you can pick these commits. You can edit the commits. But let's just say the change title commit was from branch 1. So what I'll do is I'll just drop it. Use D or just straight up delete it. And it's gone. Cool. And yeah, so again, this is a similar thing. But sometimes the PR is not mine, right? It's someone else. I need to incorporate changes from someone else's PR into my current branch for whatever reason, right? So there's a quick, you can use something called a git patch. So patch is basically, I'll take this commit, I'll download it from GitHub or from their branch or whatever, and then I'll apply it to my branch. So the easy way is just to go to their PR, and here's their PR, and add a .patch to the end of their PR. And there's your patch. Copy, paste it, or save it somewhere. And then basically run git am signoff - the patch. Right? You can, if you're on their branch, you can also use git format patch master, and then basically pipe that to my patch .patch. Yeah. Cool. So oh, have another thing. Thought that was all. Anyway, so sometimes, so Aaron briefly talked about gulp lint and check types, which are basic things that Travis checks for, but we can actually check these locally. So a common workflow is just to run them before we submit our PR, but I forget to run this every single time. And well, yeah, so yeah. But thankfully, for really forgetful people like myself, we can write a Git hook. So a Git hook is basically just a piece of code that runs before or after. So post is after, pre is before, but so before or after every single Git action. So I have, for example, I have a pre-commit hook that basically prevents me or asks me if I actually want to commit any console logs, right, in my current commit. And it looks something like this. So yeah, this is just a pre-commit hook to avoid committing console logs, because I write them, I forget to delete them, and then I don't really want to commit them. The key, the point to note here is for any Git hook, what you can do is either return 0, which means, hey, everything looks good. I actually want to go through with the commit. Or, no, everything looks terrible. Let's exit. Return 1 to say, let's abort, right? So you can ask the user, hey, there's console logs here. Do you actually want to commit it? And then if no, just exit 1. And then so the commit will abort, and you won't have actually committed anything. So this is a trivial Git hook. But the more interesting one is that Raghu has written a wonderful Git hook to run lint, check types, and local tests before we actually push. So the more useful one here is our default pre-push hook, which is located here. And then if you just run enable git push, git prepush.sh, it'll actually basically add this to your Git hooks. It'll add a pre-push hook that basically runs the default pre-push. So what this will do is run gulp lint, run gulp check types, and then run gulp test local changes. And then we won't have to add another PR on the Travis queue that is definitely going to fail. All right, that's all I have for today. Cool. Yeah.